Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter through them and give thanks to the Lord. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love, mercy endures forever. I'm pleased to be with you on this Palm Sunday as we enter into Holy Week together. We're beginning the most important week of the year for Christians, an intense week full of drama, intrigue, suffering, and death, as we see Jesus in his fateful last days in Jerusalem. It moves us from his entry into Jerusalem to his conflict with the religious authorities. He teaches his followers and eats a Passover meal with his disciples. He's betrayed and abandoned by those closest to him. He's humiliated and suffers a dreadful death, nailed to a cross. And only then comes Easter. All of this unfolds in Jerusalem, a city that has witnessed so many centuries of history. It was the ancient capital of the Israelite kingdom of David, where his son Solomon built a temple some 2,500 years ago, a temple that would stand for 400 years. Perhaps some of you have been to Jerusalem. I remember vividly my first visit there over 40 years ago. I had traveled to see my parents while my father was on sabbatical at an ecumenical institute between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. It was my first trip outside North America or Europe, and the ancient walled city of Jerusalem with its narrow, winding maze of streets offered a new and exotic experience. I walked into the old city, not through the gates of righteousness, those symbolic gates we hear about in the psalm, but through the Damascus Gate, built as an entryway by the Ottoman Turks in the 16th century. Full of bustling activity and a sensory overload of sights, sounds, and smells. There are the fragrant scents of market stalls with burlap sacks of spices or coffee beans, of fresh fruits, herbs, and vegetables, vendors of Palestinian pottery, rugs, olive wood souvenirs, and antiquities. Everyone eager to bargain and haggle to sell their wares. But the religious encounters were most fascinating to me because all varieties and intensities of religious commitment can be found in Jerusalem and in that holy land. There were, of course, bands of Christian pilgrims, Protestant, Roman Catholic, or Orthodox, coming from around the world to walk the streets and follow in the footsteps of Jesus. They would head to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over the traditional site of Jesus' tomb. But other religions also share space in that ancient city. I heard the muezzins call from the minaret, summoning Muslims to prayer, and watched as they hurried to fulfill their pious obligation, whether at home or at the Grand Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. Perhaps most striking of all was seeing the remains of the ancient temple itself in the Jewish quarter, with its foundation wall of huge blocks of stone. This was not the foundation of the Temple of Solomon, which was destroyed by the Babylonian Empire in the 6th century BCE, but the wall of the Second Temple, fortified and strengthened by Herod at the time of Jesus. Jews pray at that wall as their most holy site because the temple represents a part of God's enduring covenant with David and his house. God made a covenantal promise with King David that his dynasty would endure forever, and that the temple would endure forever. The first temple was destroyed. The second temple was rebuilt, but with a newly transformed understanding of Israel's relationship to God, born out of the suffering of war, destruction, and exile. Covenant obligations in ancient Israel were marked by chesed, a Hebrew word that is translated in our Bible as either mercy, as we heard in the Psalm translation this morning, or steadfast love in the NRSV. There is no exact translation into English. It is by no means, however, a sentimental feeling or emotion like we associate with love in English, but an ardent and enduring commitment to ongoing relationship. It is the kind of love we hear about when Jesus responds to a persnickety challenge by his arrogant opponents, testing him to name the most important commandment. He responds by reciting from his Jewish scriptures, our Old Testament book of Deuteronomy. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your mind and with all your being. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Chesed is not, it is solidarity. It is a commitment of the whole self. It links the vertical to the horizontal, our obligation and right orientation to the divine, tightly bound with our right orientation and obligation to our neighbor, to everyone who populates the horizontal axis, an axis that Jesus intentionally broadened to include all humanity, and especially to all those who suffer in mind, body, and spirit. Steadfast love, or mercy, seeks to relieve suffering of the oppressed and restore broken relationships. We hear time and again this refrain in the psalm about the goodness of God and the enduring character of divine chesed, but we also see steadfast love made manifest by Jesus in his life, his actions, his teaching, and his witness to the end, unto death, in the Gospel of Mark. Both God and Jesus evince this steadfast love through thick or thin, through disobedience, abandonment, betrayal, from the greatest to the least of us. Mark's Gospel describes Jesus' entry into Jerusalem differently than Matthew and Luke. Like the portrayal of Jesus throughout the Gospel, this is a very spare and concise narrative. It does not include a lot of detail or explanation. Jesus keeps us guessing and wondering what he is thinking, what he is doing, and why he is doing it. It is a mysteriously subdued entry. He sends 2 disciples to fetch a colt for him to ride on, and they go immediately, part of that swift-paced character of Mark's Gospel. This is an implicit link to an oracle of the prophet Zechariah, predicting a future Davidic Messiah. But we know that mainly from Matthew and Luke's Gospels. So the steadfast love of Jesus enters Jerusalem on a young donkey as a fulfillment of ancient prophecy. But this is not the grand entrance of a victorious, conquering king come to claim a political kingdom. He does not enter on a war horse, but on a beast of burden. And there is a bit of a mismatch between Jesus' humble entry and the expectations of the crowd that greet him. They cast down cloaks and leafy branches to honor him. They shout out part of the psalm we heard, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." Psalm 118 was likely a pilgrimage psalm, said by those going up to the temple in Jerusalem for the feast of Passover. Indeed, Psalm 118 is still recited at Passover, but in Jewish homes, where friends and family gather to remember God's liberation of their oppressed ancestors from slavery in Egypt. Their theology and practice was transformed once again in the wake of the suffering and expulsion of population that followed the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans. To be sure, this crowd in Mark greeting Jesus trusted in God's chesed, in God's mercy, steadfast love, and commitment to eternal covenants once made. They shout, "Hosanna," which means save us. But did they understand what that salvation would look like? Did they understand what part they might play in that action? And not just as passive spectators, but as enactors of steadfast love. Who is the blessed one who comes in the name of the Lord? Maybe it will also be one of them, or one of us. Did they understand that God was doing something new in Jesus, and they might play an active part in that? Do we understand what Jesus' transformed vision of a kingdom should look like? Here, as elsewhere in Mark's gospel, it is not the insiders who recognize and understand Jesus and his mission. It is not his disciples who are often puzzled at his teaching or flummoxed by it. They refuse to accept the hard truth that Jesus reveals about himself, that the Son of Man must suffer and experience death as part of his mission of solidarity with humanity. It is only by walking that path that he can complete his journey. The new kingdom is hidden from full view, but it is emerging and growing in the Gospel of Mark. And it is the outsiders, those at the edge of society, those not in the inner circle, who recognize Jesus. It is not the churchgoers who really get what Jesus is about, not those of us who sit weekly in the pews of Metropolitan United or St. Andrew's or St. James or St. Michael's cathedrals who best understand. It is those from the fringes of society. It is the outsiders, the marginalized, who recognize the power of Jesus to heal and transform. It is the man from Jerash whom we meet earlier in the gospel, also known as the Gerasene demoniac. He's described as possessed by demons, what we might today consider schizophrenia or another mental illness. He lived in the tombs among the dead, where he was always howling and bruising himself with stones, grievous self-harm. Then came his encounter with Jesus. He recognizes Jesus. "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Jesus expels the toxic energies that possess him until the man is healed and in his right mind once again. The man becomes a fervent evangelist who spreads the story of Jesus' power, his liberating, healing, restorative power. And it will be another outsider, a Roman centurion, a military officer who witnesses Jesus' crucifixion. After his inner circle have fled, the Roman is the only witness who will recognize Jesus as the Messiah. Truly, this was God's Son. Here in Toronto, we are far from Jerusalem, a city and a land that needs our prayers and steadfast love, even now as we witness at a distance the trauma of ongoing suffering, death, and destruction. But where is the place for steadfast love in Toronto? Can we recognize Jesus' presence in the emergent kingdom here? Where shall we look and how shall we participate? As the Black liberation theologian James Cone said, God is found where we least expect him, among the slaves in Egypt, in a manger in Bethlehem, hanging on a cross or on a lynching tree. God's steadfast love is there wherever despair and suffering threaten to cripple hope for the future. And that is where our steadfast love should be. A couple of weeks ago, when it was winter and we had warm spring weather, remember that? I decided to take a walk from my home in Seton Village down to Kensington Market. Kensington Market may just be the closest thing to the old city of Jerusalem here in Toronto, with its warren of shops and bustling and diverse crowds that show up there. I started out down Bathurst Street and then went over to Borden, and as I walked, I looked up and thought about how the cityscape had changed since my family moved here 20 years ago. So many tall skyscrapers have been built and so many condo towers. We're said to have more cranes here than all the other cities in North America combined. And we still have so much unaffordable housing. As I reached the intersection of Borden and College, I looked to the left. A line outside the Fort York Food Bank stretched halfway down that long block. I was shocked, but I shouldn't have been. I regularly see similar lineups at a smaller food bank in my neighborhood. We live in a time of severe food insecurity. This surely is not news to you either. But a report released last Monday indicates the number of people who used Ontario food banks went up 38% last year, the largest single increase recorded by the province's food bank network, and this after increases have been rising for 7 years in a row. We know that famine threatens other parts of the globe, certainly in Gaza and in the Sudan, as a result of horrendous wars. But shamefully, here food woes exist in the rich and peaceful nation of Canada in its wealthiest province. How can so few have so much wealth and so many be struggling? Where is the steadfast love of Jesus in this, and where is ours? I crossed College and to my right saw the remains of a dismantled homeless encampment by St. Stephen's in the Fields Church. It was there I spotted a life-size bronze statue. It was the figure of a cloaked man sitting on the ground, his hand held out as if asking for change. Closer examination revealed the palm was cut open like the wounds of the crucified Jesus. This sculpture is known as Panhandler Jesus. The sculptor Timothy Schmaltz has also made his cousin, Homeless Jesus. He lies on a bench outside of Regis College, the Jesuit college of the U of T, on Wellesley Street. Homeless Jesus is covered with a bronze blanket, his face shrouded. But if you walk up close, you can see the gaping wounds in his feet. There again lies crucified Jesus, steadfast and living among those on the margins. As it turns out, Homeless Jesus was rejected by two prominent Catholic churches, St. Michael's Cathedral in Toronto and St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. Rectors of both cathedrals embraced the bronze piece, but higher-ups in the New York and Toronto temples of Christianity turned it down, according to Schmaltz. Fortunately, many of our churches, including certainly Met United, show chesed for the disenfranchised and marginalized with food programs and support services that seek to remedy just a fraction of deep structural inequalities and societal dysfunctions. And indeed, Met United is showing solidarity with our financially challenged students at Emmanuel College, where I teach, by sponsoring a community lunch this next week. So we thank you most heartily, Met United. Some years back, a former student at Emmanuel College preached a memorable sermon in our chapel. She recalled a time when she lived on the streets of Toronto. Those were desperate and dismal days. She remembered also a visit on the street by two church ladies, as she called them. I guess I'm a church lady now. They were distributing hand-knit toques to folks on the street. They handed her a toque as she was sitting on the street in the cold of winter. She was so touched by that very personal and human gesture of concern and solidarity that it contributed to her healing. She kept the toque forever after. And she continues to this day with ministry of solidarity with the poor and the multiply marginalized. Open to me the gates of righteousness, that I may enter through them and give thanks to the Lord. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, his steadfast love endures forever. It may be the easy path and tempting for us to leap from the exuberance of Palm Sunday to the overflowing joy of resurrection on Easter Sunday. But that is a cheap and shallow highway. The gospel teaches us to follow and witness Jesus through his full arc of suffering this week, because he endured that pain for us. Because we too suffer, all of us at some point, from physical or emotional pain, from social injustice, death, loss, or estranged relationships. Some suffering can be healed, some only endured, some broken relationships restored, and some not. But divine chesed is there to provide balm and hope. Discerning the part we can play through human chesed in enacting the transformative vision of a peaceable kingdom can both deepen our faith and restore the souls of others. And this can bring us to a more deeply meaningful and joyous Easter. Amen.